We're continuing our lengthy journey of the temple through the Bible, all the way from the book of Eden, the Garden of Eden in Genesis, right the way through to Revelation. And our particular slice of history at the moment today is to go from Solomon, where we left it last time, through towards Herod, at least start to say something about that. And next time we pick it up with Herod and Jesus. So we're soon going to be reaching the New Testament and Jesus, and therefore us, because part of this series isn't just about history, it isn't just about stone buildings in the past, it's about what it means for us as the temple of God today. So we're stopping and thinking, what does this mean? How does this apply? Is there anything for us to learn from all this? So last time we ended up with the fact that David had done all the plans and preparations ready for Solomon to build the temple, and that was the next thing that was going to happen. So far, we've had the tabernacle and we've had the ark, which got separated from the tabernacle and ended up back in Jerusalem, but not in its own place, if you like. So David decided that he wanted to build a proper house for God and for the ark to rest in. And God said, no, I'll give you the plans, but you've got to give them to your son Solomon so that he could do it. So what's this new temple going to be like then? How does it differ from what they've had before, but how is it similar as well? How does it compare to the tabernacle? Well, some of the differences are obvious, of course. It was now made of stone. It was no longer going to be portable. It was going to be permanent where it was. But it also had the same structure as before. In other words, it still had this threefold, or what we call tripartite structure, of an outer court, an inner court, known as the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies. All temples had that sort of pattern to them of threefold, an outer, an inner, and then the holy place, the holiest place of all. And in fact, it's really the holy place and the Holy of Holies, which collectively are called the temple or the sanctuary, and the rest of it is the compound around it, or the temple area, and so on. So it has the same sort of features as before, but it was also bigger. And when you look at the dimensions, you find that the one that Solomon built was approximately twice the size of the tabernacle, in the sense that it was twice as long and twice as wide. That's at least the sanctuary area, the two main holy and holy place, Holy of Holies as well. So together, it's got bigger. And indeed, all the temples are going to get bigger and bigger. The other aspect of it is that it got taller as well. It was now going to be built with a greater height than before. So the holy place measured 18 meters by 9 meters, with a height of 13.5 meters, if you can work out what that looked like. And next to it, the Holy of Holies was now 9 meters by 9 meters, but only 9 meters high, which is interesting. It drops down in height a little bit, but that means it's a cube. And some of you might be thinking, oh yes, there's something to come about cubes when it comes to the temples of God, as we'll see in later talks when we look at the visions of Ezekiel and back to John in Revelation. So it's getting bigger and bigger, it's getting grander and grander, and now it's going to be called the house, the Beit of God. And another feature of it is that leading up into the holy place, there was now a porchway, and there were steps leading up to it. So it's much more sort of a grand entrance coming up, with huge pillars either side of it, with carvings on them of pomegranates. And they had special names called Yakim and Boaz, meaning established and strength. They were not there for support. They were there just to provide a sense of awe and majesty, and indeed of strength and stability, as you transitioned from the outer court into the most holy places. See, the outer court was designed really to be a general gathering place. Although there's important things in it, as we'll see in a minute, this was where people could be noisy, if you like. This is where activity could happen. But as you entered into the holy place, it was a special sense of God's presence. You were transitioning into a sacred interior. And I think any kind of church building or meeting place, whatever you want to call it, has to have this mix of a communal area where, yes, we can be noisy, we have our coffee and our chat and so on, but then we enter into the Lord's presence. We leave behind the hustle and bustle of daily life and realize that we're there to enter into quiet reverence and worship. So that was one feature of the new temple, which perhaps says something to us. It also was very highly decorated. It has lots of botanical imagery. It again points back to the idea of a garden sanctuary, and even therefore pointing ahead to what it was going to be like in the book of Revelation. And it was very, very golden, if you like. There's lots of golden imagery. Many of the items were overlaid with pure gold, which meant it was radiant, and everything was done with great care and following the designs that God had given to David. So it became much bigger, much grander, and in some ways more fitting to the presence of God that's going to be there. In terms of the items involved, it's the same 6 items as you get in the tabernacle. So, for instance, in the Holy of Holies, you've now got the Ark. It's back, if you like, where it should be. It's back in the Holy of Holies place. That's where the Ark was going to be. In the holy place, just outside, you still have the same 3 items, which was the altar of incense, the table of showbread, also known as the bread of the presence, and the large lampstand or menorah. And then as you go into the outer court, you've got, again, the same 2 items as before, another altar, the altar of sacrifices, which was definitely bigger, it's now 3-tiered, and an even larger bronze basin. It was known as the sea, actually. It was that big in terms of a place where the priests could do their ritual washing and so on and so on. There were also other little basins and other lampstands in this enlarged outer court. So if you want to know more details, you can perhaps look up pictures online and certainly read more about it in Kings and 2 Chronicles. So I want to say something though about the fact there were 2 altars. All the time there's been 2 altars. Why is this? One on the outside, which was the altar for the burnt offerings, for sacrifices, for sin, for the priests to be able to make those offerings. So they had the ritual washing and they made the sacrifices there. When you get closer in, the altar of incense is one, sometimes called altar of perfume or of a pleasant aroma. It was a different kind of altar in which God was blessed through what happened there, through the incense that was given and so on. And when we think about ourselves, and sometimes people say, well, we don't have an altar in our churches, or we shouldn't have an altar in our churches. I say, yeah, I get that. But there's 2 things here. The outer altar is now the cross. And some churches do have a cross in them. That's fine. It's a reminder of those things have happened, that is what the outer altar was for. But what's the inner altar about? It's about us. We are living sacrifices, aren't we? We are the ones that have to serve God on the basis of what Christ has done. So the 2-fold altars there, I think, speak to us in terms of, yes, one is now done. We don't need to make sacrifices anymore, except we make sacrifices of ourselves as we hopefully are a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The other feature of this temple, and indeed others, is that it becomes a place where God can rest. David wanted to make a special place of rest for the ark, and there's other verses that say, when the temple was built, now arise, Lord God, and come to your resting place. And also in the Psalms, this is a resting place for God. But it goes on, and here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. So I want to point out that the idea of rest when it comes to the temple really goes back to Genesis again, where when God made everything, it said he rested. And that wasn't because he was worn out, wanted to put his feet up. It was because once it was all done, he could now come, and it was a place where he could settle, but also where he could rule. It was a sense of enthronement is behind this word for rest. Here I will sit enthroned. So when it says the house of God being a resting place for God, it means it's a place where he can come, feel at home and start to rule from there, just as he does in the heavenly places. And I think he still asks this of us today, as his current temple. Are we his resting place? Are we a place where God comes and, if you like, feels at home within us, and where he can then rule through us as well as in us? Because that's part of what it is, I think, to be the temple of God today. So those are just some of the features of Solomon's temple, which I think fit in with what we've seen with the tabernacle, and we'll see further on with Herod's temple and on in our journey. Now, everything was ready for Solomon to build the temple the moment he became king, but he didn't get going very quickly. There was quite a delay in the way he did this. Now, it's going to be a more advanced project, if you like. Some of the delays were probably inevitable. And one of the things he had to do, as well as gather all the materials, was collect together a very large workforce of men that were going to build it. 183,000 men were involved. But you may remember his chosen method of recruitment was that of conscription, i.e., basically, I'm forcing you to do this. And he made it harsh for them. And as well as, therefore, the delay and the problems that went with that, he started to divide the people by the fact that some of them were now being treated very harshly when it came to construction. And the other thing that went with Solomon's work, as well as delay and division through the harshness of the labour, was that Solomon became very disobedient to God, which is why we had some of those readings earlier from Chronicles and Kings. Basically, Solomon, for all his wisdom, did lots of things that a king was told he should not do. He broke God's law in Deuteronomy, which you find in chapter 7 and chapter 17 there. That's what a king should do, what he should not do. And basically, Solomon did all the things that he should not do. And I'm sure you're aware of many of those, and I'm not going to repeat them all. But the one thing that strikes us here is that through his alliances that he made through marrying foreign wives, what did that create? It meant that he also turned towards the worship of the gods of these wives. And that's why God became very angry, because it meant that he was basically building other temples at the same time. He would put up other high places, places of sacrifice to appease the gods, apparently, of the wives that he had married. And so that's what caused God's real anger. Although, as we saw, the glory of God still came to God's temple. It had been done according to God's instruction. It was what he wanted. So he still filled his temple with the glory of God at the time of dedication. But at the same time, because of the way Solomon was going astray in his heart, in his attitude, God said, if you remember that reading, that he would ultimately tear the kingdom away from him, even though he had built the temple according to God's glory. So we've got to the point now where, having built this temple, God is basically saying, well, it's not going to last, or at least it's not going to go on forever. And I'm not very pleased with some of the things that have gone on around it. Solomon had been given every opportunity to be a successful king, to be a wise king, but what happened to his heart? His heart was turned away from God. And it's very clear in the readings we've had that his heart was not as fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of his father David had been. And so, as I say, he built these mini temples, these places of sanctuaries and sacrifice for burning incense and offerings to other gods. So in the end, it's not so much have you done the right thing, have you built the right thing, it's what's your heart and attitude as you've been doing it and afterwards. Very easy to go astray in that sense, isn't it? There are warnings here for us as part of the temple of God. You remember in the reading from 1 Kings 11 we had, God says that he will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Yet for the sake of your father David, I will not do it during your lifetime, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. But not the whole kingdom. I will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem. There's always this idea that God is going to fulfill his promises to David and for the sake of his people and for the sake of Jerusalem. Now, the subordinate mentioned there is Jeroboam, who was one of Solomon's officials, and his son was Rehoboam. Easy to get them muddled up, isn't it? But Jeroboam was the official who decided, God basically told him, you're going to do this. The kingdom was going to split at this point. Just before we get to that detail, let's emphasize again the lesson for us here as the temple of God. We cannot allow our worship of God and our commitment to him, however great it is, to become infiltrated by other religions or devotion towards other gods. And at times that might seem very tempting, very plausible, even profitable. But as Jesus put it, if you try and serve two masters, you're going to have divided loyalty. It isn't going to work. So you can't worship God, be the temple of God one day a week and maybe a few other meetings along the way, but the rest of the time be chasing after what the world has to offer. Now, in Solomon's case, he didn't lose the kingdom immediately, as Saul had done. It wasn't taken from him during his lifetime, nor was he to be the end of the line, but it did result in a devastating split and rebellion, which was going to have great consequences for the temple eventually. So, as I said, Jeroboam gained the allegiance of 10 tribes and established a new kingdom under his reign. That meant he set up a new capital, Shechem. And because he didn't want people to go to Jerusalem and go to the temple there, because that might draw them back to Rehoboam, he had to set up new centers of worship, his own temple areas, one in Bethel, one in Dan. But there, of course, he placed golden calves and said, "These are your gods. This is what you now worship." Basically, these were rival temples to the one that Solomon had built in Jerusalem, but not according to any instructions from the Lord, not based upon any work of the Spirit. In fact, they were based upon idolatry. So the northern kingdom, which we know fell first to Assyria, was because all their kings followed in their heart the ways of Jeroboam, were not faithful to Israel's God. The situation in the southern kingdom, and of course that one tribe was Judah, but with Benjamin, the little tribe, tacked onto it, that was basically going to be known just as Judah from now on. They formed the southern kingdom, but they didn't always do that much better either. They had some good kings, some bad kings, so they lasted longer, if you like. And what made a king a good king was that his heart followed that of David. He was as devoted to the Lord as David had been. But they also had bad kings who did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as David had done. And so there were very strong messages, prophecies against them, warnings that what would happen to what had happened to the northern kingdom would happen to the southern kingdom as well. Just having the original temple was not going to save them if they were still corrupt and faithless. A religion that was not true to God's ways would be worthless when it came to averting the same fate as Big Paul and the northern kingdom. So Judah also went into exile. You know, the rest of the tribes under the Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar came along, looted the temple of its treasures, and then returned, eventually completely destroyed. Everything was taken away, completely broken up, and transported back to Babylon. The treasures, as well as the things like the two pillars and the big bronze basin, everything was broken up and taken back. That was the end of the temple once so glorious and central to Judaism. And at that point, the Ark of the Covenant disappears from the story. We'll perhaps say more about that another time. It's not really clear where it went, or even totally when it went. And as you know, there's all sorts of interesting ideas and stories about it. But the Ark of the Covenant disappears from the temple history at this point. So it's interesting, isn't it, that God not only allowed this to happen, but deemed it necessary under the circumstances. But he gave plenty of warnings beforehand. That one from 2 Chronicles is interesting, isn't it? That, yes, I will uproot them from my land. I will reject this temple, which I have consecrated for my name. I will make it a byword and an object of ridicule. It become a heap of rubble. People will pass by and say, "Why has the Lord done this?" And the answer is because they have forsaken the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who brought them out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshipping and serving them. That's why he has brought all this disaster on them. I think the message for us there is very clear, but it's a strong passage to take note of, because if God was prepared to do that then, to this temple which he wanted, he filled with his glory, and was set up as a place of rest for him, if he was prepared to let this happen to that, well, what about us? Is it a warning for us as the current temple of God? The kingdom of Judah may have thought they were safe and secure because they had this wonderful building here in the center of Jerusalem. It guaranteed God's presence and their status and the possession of the land, but they were wrong in taking it for granted. And we might fall into that same error sometimes. Certainly, we see, don't we, in the early chapters of the book of Revelation, how the risen Lord Jesus visits his churches, those 7 churches, and assesses them. And he rewards those who listen to what his Spirit is saying and who remain faithful to him. But he also warns that he will shut down, basically, remove the lampstand of others that ignore his words. So it's not enough for a church just to maintain its routines and rituals and think it's doing well, but to find out what is God actually saying about us. How does God see us? Tradition might keep things going, but are we still encountering the living God? If not, then maybe as a church, we are declining, dwindling, even dying. And this part of Israel's history, I think, teaches us to keep a constant check upon ourselves as God's temple today. Where does judgment begin? At the house of the Lord. So we always need to check ourselves first. So do people pass by churches now and think of them as heaps of rubble, effectively, objects of ridicule, broken down, no longer relevant, perhaps to be pitied or mocked? That's what we need to know. What do people look at? What do they see when they look at the church today? So just to briefly move us on to the next bit of the story, because the destruction of Solomon's temple was pivotal, but not the end, because for the sake of David and of Jerusalem more was to come. God had a covenant promise with David that he wanted to complete and would complete. He had even bigger plans to accomplish. So after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, as we know, they returned. Cyrus, king of Persia, allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and therefore to rebuild Jerusalem and indeed to rebuild their temple. Now, as you know, Cyrus, being Persian, was not of David's line, so he couldn't fulfill that covenant promise. He was just God's chosen one for that particular job at the time. He was instrumental in the plans of God, and that was an important step. But he was not, as I say, going to be that final fulfillment. But he did allow them to return. They could take back some of the treasures that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen, and I think he gave them money to help them rebuild and so on. So they got back and they started to rebuild. And the first thing they did was a good thing. They just built an altar and made sacrifices on it. And we've seen before how that's making a simple little sanctuary is always a good way to start. Build an altar, make a sacrifice. And then they started to lay the foundations. And it had great emotional impact at that point. There were great shouts of joy, but also loud weeping for those that could remember the former temple and thought it's not going to be anything like we had before. And so at this point in their rebuilding of the temple, the progress came to a halt. And there's for 2 reasons that they got discouraged. One is there was opposition from their enemies, but also suddenly there was a lack of zeal. They'd lost that sense of why they had returned and what they were meant to now be doing for God. And so they just stopped. It all sort of dried up. Something else was required to get the job finished. They knew what they had to do. It was the same instructions, the same basic plan as before that they were going to rebuild. But what did they lack? Well, what they lacked really was the involvement of the Spirit of God that came through prophetic words of encouragement. They needed to hear from God. They needed these prophetic words of encouragement. And they came mainly at this point through Zechariah and Haggai. And they were mainly directed towards Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua, the high priest, whose responsibility it was. And so the prophets firstly chastised them for neglecting the task and told them to give careful thoughts to your ways. But at the same time, the word came through, I am with you. And that was the motivation to get them back to work. I am with you, declares the Lord. And in fact, it was also said that one day the glory of the new temple would exceed that of the one built by Solomon. And as well as filling it with glory, the Lord would also bring the desire of all nations to the house. And there's already beginning to be a prophetic sort of element of there's going to be more to come even when we've built what we're building now. As for Zechariah, he's very well known for that famous verse that everybody quotes, "Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord." People quote that perhaps without realizing that this is about rebuilding the temple. Might and power refers to the strength and capabilities of men, and men would take part in the project, of course, but it needed the Spirit of God for it to actually happen. And we had that little passage from Zechariah 6 read, and we'll come back to that. But I just wanted to get that across to you at this point, that this is another prophecy of something that's going to happen. You know, it mentions Joshua. Well, that's going to be Jesus. It talks about the branch. Oh, that's going to be Jesus. It talks about the priest and the king coming together and being one. Excuse me. So that's going to be Jesus. So already this prophetic encouragement, they may not have understood everything about it, but it gave them the impetus to get on and build what they had to build from that point. And I think that we all need these prophetic words of encouragement from God, and we should seek God in whatever we're trying to do for him. We should seek for these words directly from his spirit or maybe through other people. And perhaps there's certain ones that we already know from the scriptures themselves. After all, remember that another one that's there, which refers to the temple or the return of the people, is that my plans for you are not to harm you, but to prosper you, to prosper you. And that was the original context of it. But we might want to hear God say that to us as we go about serving him. And the simple messages of Jesus, like, I am with you till the end of the age. Those are the sort of things that can stir us from our lethargy or our self-centered living and inspire us to fulfill the work that he has us to do. So as we come to the end for today, the second temple, as it became known, began to be built at that point under Zerubbabel. But we don't know it as that. We know it as Herod's temple. So how did that come about? Where do we get the idea of it being Herod's temple? Well, in 63 BC, the Romans entered Jerusalem. The general Pompey came, captured Jerusalem, and brought Judea under Roman rule. But he didn't destroy the temple. He didn't even loot it. He allowed everything to continue the same. And then in BC 37, Herod became king of Judea, and he reigned there, as you know, through to about AD 4. But Herod was not a true Jewish leader. He was only half Jewish, and he was an Edomite, really, an outsider to Judaism. And he was effectively a puppet king being placed there by the Romans to rule on their behalf. So he was not favored by the Jewish people. And to try and gain favor with them, he said, I'm going to rebuild your temple even bigger, even better, even grander than before. I'll make it the largest and most magnificent you've ever known. And he began to rebuild the temple in 19 BC. And for the first 5 years, I think it was just preparation. These great big stones were going to be quarried before they were brought, from the quarry, brought to the site. And it took another 10 years to really get the work going. But it wasn't even finished by the time of Jesus. They kept adding bits to it. But this is the temple we know of as Herod's temple. It's the one that Jesus visited. It's the one where Jesus did a lot of teaching and went to for the various feasts. It was the one that the disciples said, what a wonderful building, what massive stones, what great magnificence. And where Jesus said, but one day that's all going to come down. It will be dismantled, stone by stone. See, Herod had not built it for the glory of God. He hadn't got his instructions from God. He did it for his own glory, to impress men, to gain approval, so that he could have a legacy, if you like, of I'm someone who's built this wonderful new building. So perhaps that's one reason why Jesus predicted that this could not be the final temple that God really wanted. So that's brought us up to date to the point of Herod, which we'll pick up next time. We'll see what his temple was like. But in particular, at the same time, we've now going to have this overlap in which the next temple, Jesus himself, is going to be born and is going to minister there and have a clash with those who actually ran the temple and basically see what happens in the next part of the story as we go from Herod to Jesus. And then after the summer break, we'll be able to think more about what happened in the book of Acts and on towards the book of Revelation. But I'll leave it there for now and talk to you again later. Thank you.